me, that was the piece of music that struck me this morning. So a few years ago, there was a story that made national headlines. There was a mostly African-American summer camp that had paid dues to a local swim club for the kids to come and swim. When they had arrived the morning that they were supposed to arrive, they were treated to subtle and not so subtle racial slurs. The day, as described by many of those campers and counselors, was absolutely horrifying and traumatizing. This happened in 2009. How could that be? The campers and the counselors left that day. They thought maybe it was just a few bad seeds, a few bad apples at the swim club. They couldn't possibly represent the entire place. It turns out, unfortunately, that they were wrong. They received a phone call that evening letting the summer camp know that their fees would be refunded and that their campers were not welcome. They would be barred from returning. 2009. As you all know, I am a proud Philadelphian. And if it's even possible, I'm even more proud to be from Northeast Philadelphia. Working class section, residential section of Philadelphia. My pride, my Philadelphia pride was shattered that day in 2009 when I saw the news story flash across my computer screen on CNN. That swim club was not in the Deep South, not some far-off place. No, it took place a few blocks from where I grew up. Right there in front of me were pictures of the Valley Swim Club, a place I must have passed hundreds, if not thousands, of times. What must the conversation between those young children and their parents have been that night? They were children. How could their parents possibly explain to them what they had experienced, what had happened? Could you imagine anybody in this room having to explain that to your child? Recently, and I hope he's in the room, Terry Pridgeon, our custodian, and I were talking about this very story. I naively asked him, I said, Terry, how would you have talked to your own son if that were him experiencing the racism of that day? Rabbi Terry said, I can guarantee you that was not the first time those parents were talking to their kids about something like that. I looked at Terry and said, well, what do you mean? Rabbi, we all tell our children to keep their heads down, do better than everyone else, and make sure you stay out of trouble. He continued, look, Rabbi, it's not fair. I know it. You and I know it. It's just the way it is. I sunk my head down, and how naive I was. How so naive I was to think that on that hot summer's night in 2009, a conversation about what it means to be black in America would be taking place for the very first time in those Philadelphia homes. In her book, Waking Up White, Debbie Irving writes the following: unlike poverty, skin color is visible and fixed, forever and always. Skin color translates into expectations on the part of onlookers. White skin can erroneously bring high expectations and a message you belong. Dark skin, she continues to write, can erroneously bring low expectations and the message you don't belong. I ask us all, can you imagine telling any of your children what Terry tells his son? Keep your head down, don't speak up, don't get in trouble. Yet isn't that what many American Jewish parents told their kids but a few generations ago? When we first came to this country as immigrants, the only thing that separated us from the rest of America were our funny accents, our lack of education, and our names, all of which we could change while still maintain a sense of identity, a sense of who we were, a sense of our Jewishness. In a few generations, we as American Jews went from telling our kids to keep your heads down, don't make any trouble, to keep your heads up. The sky's the limit. Rabbi Daniel Hartman, in a very powerful piece of Torah, teaches that when we read the book of Esther, When we as a Jewish community think about the story of Purim, there's a danger. There's a danger for each and every one of us. A danger for us as a community to become like Queen Esther. But how can that be? Queen Esther, after all, is the heroine. She stood up for what she believed in. But Rabbi Daniel Hartman digs deep beneath the text and he says the following. Queen Esther became comfortable in the confines of the palace, happy to live a blissful existence locked away, in his words, in a palace of privilege. This morning on Yom Kippur, I must admit to myself and to this community, in many ways, I have felt like I have become Queen Esther, locked away in my own palace of privilege. While in just a few generations, the conversations we've had with our kids have, thank God, they have mostly changed. They remain the same in communities of color across this country. As a community, we came here as Mordechai, dressed in sackcloth. And but a few generations, we, each and every one of us, have become like Queen Esther. Over the past year, Terry and I, and in fact, our entire office team, have had many conversations about race in America. And I thank God for those conversations. They are honest, they are frank, and they are real, and they're hard. But they're open. I'm grateful to Terry for always be willing to share his story with me. And often at the end of our conversations, we both lament, why does it take a tragedy? Why does it take a big event for us to have to speak openly and honestly? Why does it take things like Baltimore and Ferguson and the horrible and unthinkable massacre that took place at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston? Why aren't we having these conversations more often? Rabbi, he recently said, imagine how different it could be if we talked more openly and more honestly about race with one another. Today is Yom Kippur, a chance for us to engage in Cheshbon HaNefesh, the accounting of the soul. Part of our collective and individual work, I believe we have to do as a Jewish community this Yom Kippur, is reflect on our community's past and how it can inform our future. Imagine how different the world would be. Imagine how different it could be if we only had a more open and honest dialogue about this very topic. My colleague, Rabbi Jessica Olian Kirshner, recently challenged us to answer as a Jewish community the following questions. And I challenge us all today and myself to think about them and engage in a conversation with one another as a first step. She said to us, or she writes, does the racial mix of our lives look the way we want it to? What are the biases we each hold? And how does that affect what we do and how we react? What are our fears? And what benefits do we as a Jewish community enjoy willingly or not? These are by no means easy questions. This is not an easy topic. But that does not mean we should not ignore it. That does not mean we should not open ourselves up to engaging in the dialogue. And yet, as we answer these questions, we must also recognize that there are so many lives in our country that are at stake. Each and every day, our country continues down this path of hate and systemic inequality. And while our bodies may not be at risk, certainly our collective souls are. This is why it is essential for us to begin this conversation. Over 50 years ago, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught at a conference that the first conference on race and religion, the main participants were Moses and Pharaoh. He went on to say that the outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. 50 years ago, I want to repeat those words. He said, the exodus begun, but is far from over. The exodus begun, but it is far from over. Those words are as true when he first spoke them in 1963 as they are today. The Jewish community, and especially the Reformed Jewish community, was there side by side with Dr. King and others as they fought faithfully for the civil rights of others. The stories are told over and over again with pride how the historic landmark Civil Rights Bill was signed at the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. How a group of rabbis left the CCAR convention, the Central Conference of American Rabbis convention. They left to join Dr. King in protest and to be arrested. And the pictures, we know them, they're famous. Rabbi Heschel standing next to Dr. King, arms intertwined, holding the Sefer Torah. In fact, there are some of you in this room, many of you perhaps, who marched with others, who were part of that movement to help our country move forward. However, here's the thing. We've been telling the same stories for 50 years. And while indeed much progress has been made, as Rabbi Heschel points out, the exodus, my friends, is far from over. The cry of injustice is as loud as it was more than 50 years ago. While our country has indeed changed in the years since we as a Jewish community first marched, many of our stories have not. This summer, as I know many of you watched and followed along, over 200 Reform rabbis and countless other members of the Jewish community, including our very own cantor and our Director of Congregational Learning, Susan Cosden, joined the NAACP, the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, on this March for Justice this summer. We all partnered together with the NAACP on a march that began in Selma and ended in Washington, D.C. Over 40 days, over 1,000 miles, a march that, as Cornell Brooks, the president and CEO of the NAACP, described, was about our lives, our votes, our jobs, our schools matter. The goal was simple: to mobilize activists and advance a focus of national advocacy that protects the right of every American to fair criminal justice system, uncorrupted and unfettered access to the ballot box, sustainable jobs, and a living wage. This summer, each and every day of over 40 days and over 1,000 miles, we carried a Sefer Torah together. In fact, the chief executive of the CCAR is here with us this morning. He and our colleagues marched holding that Sefer Torah, one day at a time, one step at a time. But we did not carry it alone. We carried it together with each and every person that participated in that march. Black, white, together. The day I spent on the march was even more moving than I could have imagined. I know I've talked to Susan and our cantor and Steve about this, Rabbi Fox about this. How moving it truly was to be a part of such a march. The first day I arrived, we started marching in the morning. And I thought to myself, a Torah scroll, a rabbi, and African Americans marching past the fields that were once plowed by slaves. Indeed, how far we have come. Indeed, how far we have come. But, and I don't like to say but this morning I say but then I came home and I had a conversation with my daughter Noah, and I tried to explain to her what I was doing. And she said to me, Abba, didn't Dr. King march already? Isn't that all behind us? Brokenhearted, I said, no, there's still much work that needs to be done. Do you know how when you meet certain people, right away they're going to have an impact in your life? We've all met them, right? When you meet them, their soul shines forth. When you meet them in that moment, you know something special. You know you're in the presence of somebody special. On the march, I met somebody special. His name was Middle Passage. When the call came out to march was taking place, Middle Passage took a bus from Colorado to Selma, Alabama. He had an amazing story, a disabled veteran who almost led the entire march, holding the American flag. We followed Middle Passage. His goal was to march each and every step of the way, but unfortunately, about a week or so before the march ended, he fell ill while holding the American flag that was so dear to him, and he passed away. Middle Passage was one of those people who just had an impact on you the minute you met him. In an interview with the reporter, he said, "I am marching for better jobs, better schools, and better justice for everyone in my country." In his humble way, he referred to himself as just a foot soldier following orders. But it was we who followed him each and every day. He went on to say, we're all from different walks of life coming together for one common cause. We're working together as a unit for the betterment of justice of everybody, he said, regardless of race, creed, color, or religion. He reminded me, and he taught us all, that we're in it together. We've all got work to do, he was quoted as saying, to preserve what we have. He said it's a struggle. Freedom is not free, and he knew because he was a veteran. I wish I could say that because we marched, things have changed. They haven't. I wish I could say if we did just this one thing, if we went this one place together, things will change. I cannot. The problems are systemic, they are big, and they are challenging, and they are difficult with no easy answers. Yet, I am incredibly proud of our movement, our Reformed Jewish movement, and the CCAR and the RAC, and all of the people who participated in the march this summer, because all great and hard journeys begin with the first step. And what I learned this summer most of all from Middle Passage and all of the folks with whom we marched, is sometimes just showing up can mean so much. In our Shabbat Siddur, our Mishkan Tefillah, we find the following words. Disturb us, O Adonai. Ruffle our complacency. Make us dissatisfied with the peace of ignorance. Shock us, Adonai. Deny us the false Shabbat, which gives us the delusion of satisfaction amid a world of war and hatred. Disturb us, God, and vex us. These are the words of the Siddur on Shabbat morning. Indeed, this conversation about race in our country is hard, and perhaps we as a community in the past 50 years, we have moved from talking to our kids about keeping their heads down to talking to them about keeping their heads up. Perhaps there's a piece of us that has forgotten our own stories of pain and persecution in this country. The story of suffering from injustice and equality, it is our story. We must remember our call to this sacred work as we were strangers in the land of Egypt. We may now be Esther, but we will always, always be Mordechai. Over the past several weeks as I've been preparing, I've had great conversations with my friend Dana Owens of the Messiah Baptist Church in East Orange. I was telling him about the sermon and what I wanted to teach this morning. And I asked him at one point, well, what do you think my temple community, what do you think my Jewish community needs to hear? He said to me, very much the same way Middle Passage said, that we are all in this together. The scourge of hate and racism affects each and every one of us. And then he said this. He said, Greg, my voice is your voice, and your voice is my voice. And just as I tell my community that this is not about us and them, this is about us, so too can you. And so we agreed. This is about our neighbors. This is about all of us. This morning, we opened with the words, here I am ready to fulfill the mitzvah of my Creator, to love thy neighbor as thyself. The focus of our prayers, the very first thing we uttered this morning, reminds us that our prayers are meaningless and empty if they don't lead us to action, if they don't lead us to bring more love, more justice, and more peace in the world. I recently learned a story from a colleague that I wanted to share. It's the story that appears in the Talmud. A rabbi and his students are gathering together, and the rabbi sort of coyly asks, when does the night end and the day begin? One student raises his hand and says, well, when you can tell a goat from a lamb. Seems reasonable enough, right? Rabbi, no response. Another student raises his hand and says, when you can tell an olive tree from a fig tree. The rabbi hangs his head. Says, no, my students, no. The night is over and the day begins when a stranger approaches and we recognize him as our brother. And I add, as our sister. Night is still upon us, and it feels at times like we are more strangers than we are neighbors, but I know there is hope for us to reach out, to call out brother and sister. Here's the hard part. Where do we go from here? I think first it begins with an honest conversation with ourselves and one another, thinking back to the questions that my colleagues asked us. This year, as part of my Rabbi's Tish program, we'll be engaging in that dialogue with one another and in that conversation. Second, in the coming year, Dana Owens, the preacher at the Messiah Baptist Church in East Orange, he and I will be working together to bring our communities together. He will preach here, and I am so nervous about this. I will preach there. And together we will work to bring our neighbors closer. This is the point where I usually tie the sermon up nice and neatly, right? I bring it all together and I say, this is what we're really going to do. But I wish I could do that here, but I can't. The work that Dr. Heschel and Dr. King and many of our colleagues and many of you who are in this room began over 50 years ago is far from complete. But this is our chance, this is our time to jump in and bring closer together our vision of a world redeemed. A world where Terry and other fathers like